Hola, buenos días, buenas tardes, o buenas noches. This video is going to deal with weather and talking about the weather in general. Weather is one of those things that everybody seems to talk about, even if they don't really like it all that much. It's kind of the awkward fill-in for a conversation, and just like in English, it's talked about in Spanish a lot as well. We're going to look at today the most basic ways to talk about the weather. There are so many different ways to talk about it, but we'll stick with just the most basic ones for today. The first thing to know are some useful terms or some vocabulario útil. Primero, la palabra tiempo. Tiempo significa weather. Hace significa it makes, it does, or when talking about the weather, it can often mean it is. Now that comes from the verb hacer, which means to do or to make. Está. It is. Mucho, which we have learned to mean a lot. Poco, which we have learned to mean a little. Keep those useful phrases in mind today as you're watching this video, completing the assignment, and in the future when you're trying to talk about the weather in general, those terms will be very handy for you. The main question associated with weather is ¿Qué hace el tiempo? ¿Qué hace el tiempo? And that means, what is the weather like? Or quite literally, what does the weather make? Or what is the weather doing? In English, we know that we say, what's the weather like? And you can respond in a bunch of different ways. Well, you can respond in a bunch of different ways as well in Spanish. So let's take a look at those different ways. So let's look at the word hace. If we want to respond to the question, ¿Qué hace el tiempo?, we can use the word hace to talk about what the weather does, or literally makes. Let's start by looking at a couple of positive weather terms. We can use the word hace to talk about all of these different weather terms. I highly recommend taking notes as I say these, write them down, and even try repeating them out loud. So if someone says, ¿Qué hace el tiempo?, we could say, hace buen tiempo, or it's good weather. Hace mucho calor. It's very hot. Or literally, it makes a lot of heat. Hace sol. It is sunny. Or literally, it makes sun. Now let's look at some of the more less liked weather terms. Maybe the weather is not so great outside. If someone asks you the question, ¿Qué hace el tiempo?, hace mal tiempo. It's bad weather. Hace mucho frío. It's very cold. Hace frío. It's cold. Hace viento. It's windy. Hace fresco. It's cool. Hace mucho viento. It's very windy. Hace is not the only way to talk about the weather. We can also use the verb está, which we know means it is. And this is talking about what the weather is doing. Now, the question that's asked is still, ¿Qué hace el tiempo? What is the weather doing? But with certain words, we have to use the verb está. We'll get more into why that is a little bit later this year, but basically all you have to remember is that we use it in front of these three terms. Está lloviendo. It is raining. Notice it has the ing ending, and that's one reason why we have to use está. It is raining. Está nevando. Está nevando. It is snowing. Está nublado. Está nublado. It is cloudy. And of course, there's more ways to talk about the weather. If you don't want to say it is raining or it is snowing, kind of without the ing ending, if you want to say it rains or it snows, we have different ways to say that as well. Llueve, llueve. That means it rains. Now that comes from the verb llover, which means to rain. Keep in mind the double L makes a Y sound, so that would be pronounced llueve. Nieva, nieva, and that means it snows. And that comes from the verb nevar, which of course means to snow. So for example, if you wanted to talk about what the weather was going to do in the near future, you could use llover and nevar after talking about going to. Let me throw an example on the screen for you. So we have the sentence va a llover hoy. It is going to rain today. We can talk about the near future and using that going to followed by an infinitive verb which will always have the AR, ER, or IR ending. And the same idea applies if we want to say it is going to snow. Va a nevar. It is going to snow. Just keep in mind that your infinitive verb will have the AR, ER, or IR ending. Finally, let's get to talking about the temperature, or la temperatura. This is something that's widely discussed. Everybody always talks about the temperature. How warm is it going to be? How cold is it going to be today? And that plays a big part in our life, what we're going to wear, what we're going to do, maybe we're inside or outside. So talking about the temperature is important. One thing I want you to notice is that in the United States and a couple other countries, they use this thing called Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit is notated by the symbol with the little degree sign and the F, and that means that it's using a certain scale to measure temperature. And we use that in the United States, more or less. There's also this thing called Celsius, and that's denoted by the little circle, the degrees, and the C for Celsius. And that is used in most other countries, including all Spanish-speaking countries. And that's using a different scale, where 0 is freezing and 100 degrees is boiling. So a temperature like 32 degrees might actually be pretty warm, whereas 0 degrees is when snow can form at about 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So keep that in mind. They use a different scale. So when we're talking about the temperature, if you see a temperature of 12 degrees Celsius, well, that's actually really not that cold, even though it sounds cold to us. So keep that in mind, Celsius in Spanish-speaking countries. As I'm sure you already probably guessed, there are multiple ways to say the temperature in Spanish as well, just to confuse you, of course. You can say está a, then the number, grados. It is at whatever the temperature might be, and then grados, which means degrees. This is the big difference here, the a. Está a. It is at a number of degrees. The other way to say it would be hace, then the number, grados. It is the number of degrees. You're saying the same thing, just in a different way. You may use either one. Just keep in mind that after está, you need to use the a to say at. So if this were our thermometer, 18 degrees, notice it's Celsius, which is not too warm, not too cool, kind of right in the middle. We have two different ways to say the temperature. Está a 18 grados. Hace 18 grados. Either one works. You're saying the same thing, just different ways to say it. Get comfortable using both, and don't be afraid to practice using each way of saying it. You'll hear it both different ways, depending on where you're at and who's saying the temperature. Okay, so let's get some practice. The question for each of these four pictures will be the same, ¿Qué hace el tiempo? And in each picture, there are different things going on with the weather, and there may be more than one correct answer. So practice writing the answers out to that question, ¿Qué hace el tiempo? For each picture. I'll give you a few seconds. Feel free to hit the pause button here to give yourself time to tell me what the weather is like in each picture. And then the answers will pop up in a few seconds, and you can check your answers. But please pause and give yourself a shot at getting the weather here for each picture. So let's take a look at each of the four pictures. ¿Qué hace el tiempo? ¿Hace sol? ¿Hace buen tiempo? No está nublado. Each of these options makes sense and would be fine, and you may even have something else that makes sense as well. I'm using hace and está to talk about the same picture, same type of weather. Really, it just depends on what you want to say, as long as you keep the two straight, hace and está. Está lloviendo. Llueve. Hace mal tiempo. Any one of these, again, works. Está lloviendo, it is raining. Llueve, it rains. Hace mal tiempo, it is bad weather. Hace viento, or hace mucho viento, looks like it might be very windy. Está nublado, it is cloudy. Hace buen tiempo, looks like fairly nice weather for the most part. And finally, nieva, it snows. Está nevando, it is snowing. Hace frío. Again, any one of these works, and you maybe even have something different. Hace mucho frío, or something different. I hope this has helped. If you need to rewind, go back and watch something again, feel free to do so. Good luck. Buena suerte.